Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Coates, General Ashley, very good to see you again. Thank you for your service. Director Coates, I'd like to start with you, please. In your opening statement, you note that U.S. allies and partners' uncertainty about the willingness and capability of the United States to maintain its international commitments may drive them to consider reorienting their policies, particularly regarding trade, away from Washington. And as we await the President's decision on imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, I believe that it is important that we consider any national security implications that this might have, those tariffs. The National Defense Strategy states that the U.S. needs to strengthen current alliances and foster new partnerships in order to combat threats around the globe. And just from your perspective, Director, what message do you think this tariff would say to our allies and partners? And can you explain how our relationships with other countries can aid in our national security efforts?
Well, the threats that we see around the world obviously need to be looked at in the context of who's on our side and who are adversaries, and how we can better maintain relations with our allies in order to address these. When General Mattis talked about we're trying to address some of these situations through by, with, and through, it means working with allies. Obviously, trade is one of many, many threads of that tie us together. There are pros and cons. The President's announcement recently has not been finalized, as you know, and was done so in the context of national security, the concern that certain types of materials like steel and aluminum are important for national security purposes, to have that capacity here and not to be relying on foreign entities, even some that we might call adversaries now but might not be later. But our job in the intelligence community is to assess things after they've happened and or are about to happen, and try to provide information to our policymakers so that they can make determinations on the policy. So I really am not in a position to discuss policy on trade, but the IC will provide everything we can to influence and to provide, not influence, excuse me, to provide policymakers with what they need to make those decisions.
Very good. Well, I often notice anytime that any of us up here are attending defense talks overseas, whether it's the Shangri-La Dialogue or the Munich Security Conference, that not only do we talk about national defense, but we also seem to talk about trade, especially in the Pacific. You know, the chairman just stated that we returned from an overseas trip just a couple weeks ago, and oftentimes many of those partners really do emphasize the need to remain strong trade partners, because where there's an absence of U.S. trade, often we see China stepping in to close those gaps. Obviously I'm a strong supporter of our trade relationships. And Director Coates and General Ashley as well, from that CODEL, the experiences that we took away, we had the opportunity to talk about some of the challenges we face on the Korean Peninsula. And we have seen where North Korea has been able to garner support through illicit trade. And just example, we know that North Korea has exported ballistic missile technology to countries like Iran and Syria. Can you talk about how the intelligence community can aiding and restricting that flow of illicit materials overseas, just as briefly as you can?
We take proliferation, particularly weapons of mass destruction, very, very seriously, and try to track that to the very best of our abilities. We know of the history of North Korea transfers for cash and for other reasons. It's particularly critical now as we are dealing with a very serious situation with North Korea. We have seen workarounds, sanctions that have been imposed by the North Koreans to achieve essentially revenue
And
to support their military. So it's something that we take very seriously. It's a very high priority for us.
Okay. And General Ashley, is that something through the military community we're able to work with partner nations to share information to stop that trade?
So I think what you want to do is make sure you sensitize all the nations that would be somewhere in that supply chain as to where the risk might lie and how they might interdict that. The challenge with some of the technologies, it's dual use. So some of the chips, they're not necessarily prohibited. When you actually start moving the stuff from a maritime standpoint, we've seen more aggressive behavior around the peninsula in terms of trying to catch transshipments and other actions like that. So that kind of aggressive actions will, serve our interests in terms of being able to interdict that. But really sensitizing all the nations that are involved in those regions to the potential movement of commodities, anything that's tied into the development of a missile or all the components that you would use to build that would be something that we would share across all those nations and all those defense departments.
Very good.